Does anyone? Hello? I was just wondering if it started. Well, I know if it starts, it will tell me. Okay. Hi, I'm Lady Bisha, and I'm here to show you how to construct, organize, and plan cosplays. So, I brought some examples with me today, but I wanted to start with organizing cosplays. So, everyone knows the dreaded con crunch. It's always the roughest part of the cosplays. Staying up all night making this, which isn't the best thing because sometimes you don't like how it turns out. I know I've been there before, so I wanted to talk about how to organize that so you're not in that con crunch. So what I like to do is I like to plan them 6 months out, especially for my own personal cosplay, so I have a lot of time to get it done. That being said, I have a few projects going, and it's taking me some time to make them, making sure that I have all my techniques mastered so that they look really good, making sure all the materials are perfect. Sometimes it takes me a little bit longer, and I just want to make sure. That's just because I want to make sure everything is good. For example, I have Neuro over here. I can get her. It's been taking me a while to get it done. So I have the skirt and then built in different layers. But this has been taking me a while because I wanted to make sure that I had the perfect shape for them. So when I went in and made that, I organized it with techniques I wanted to use. I researched the materials. That being said, let's start with the organizing portion of it first. When I started organizing my cosplays, I took pictures and I printed them out. I put them up on my wall so I knew which ones that I wanted to do. And I have a little board here in my room with all the clips of what I'm going to cosplay. And then I'm telling you, the most satisfying thing is just checking them off, saying that you completed them. Usually that doesn't happen because I never complete cosplays, and it shows when you sit there wanting to improve and improve and improve on everything. Being said, that is how I like to organize my cosplays, but sometimes people do it a little bit differently. It's like in writing class when you would sit there making charts. Sometimes that helps people, just organizing your ideas and thinking about how you want to go about it. Next would be planning cosplays, so actually executing. So going on the internet and researching a technique you want to use, or researching the kind of materials you're going to use, the notions, or how you're going to construct it. There's so much that goes into sewing cosplays. It's crazy. Like, you need to get the right needle, get the right thread, make sure that you have enough of the right material, because trust me, if you have to color match, which is when you have to take a color and make sure that it is the same exact material, it is really hard to do because even the batches are a little bit off. Even the batches that they dye the fabric with is a little bit off, and it shows when you put pieces up against each other. That being said, if you're deciding to going into planning a cosplay, I like to use a sketchbook, which is right here, which doesn't look very organized, but we're just gonna go through that. Let me find a really good page. So this is one of my earlier designs that I really liked. It was a jacket based off of the character from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Jolie. So I just kind of drew it out but that one never really did get truly executed. I did make a version of it, but it was not the way I had initially drawn it. Or playing with materials. That is also part of the planning process. Playing with materials so that you can see what you want to use. I didn't end up using all of this. I think I ended up using these two, and then these were never used in the first place. But it makes for some, I like to call it word vomit, basically, because you're just throwing your ideas into a book so that you have somewhere to put them. Sometimes even having a few swatches on hand is helpful so that you can effectively plan them. So just laying in my journal, I ended up actually using this fabric for one of my cosplays. It is a little bit stressful not having a clear plan. I can't give you a clear plan because everyone's a little bit different on how they want to go about it. But when you're sitting down and you're thinking about how you're going to execute it, you're going to look down at all these, when you organized it, you're going to look down at all the footwork that you did, and you're going to think, oh, this is how I want to execute it. That being said, when you're actually going into planning dates and when you're going to have it done, it's good to set goals. Like, by the end of the month, I want to have 50% of this cosplay done. Don't be super specific because usually it doesn't go the way you want to, or you want to work on something else, or you want to move on, because sitting there obsessing over one thing doesn't help you. Trust me. If you're sitting there obsessing over, let's say, for example, the construction of the top, but you ignore the skirt, you're gonna end up causing yourself to push yourself backwards because you spent more time on the top than you did the skirt, and now you have no time for the skirt. Being said, this is one of my favorites. So I just kind of word vomited my ideas onto here, and this is how I was going to execute it, or how I decided to execute it. That was my planning. This is my very messy planning. I have my fabrics here so that I knew what I was working with. I could test them, which is also very part of the planning process, but we'll get into that later. So when I wrote on it, you can't really read my handwriting, so I said, keep as one piece. So as a reminder to myself, this is going to be one separate piece. Keep as one piece. How I was going to add bias tape, what size it was going to be, it helped me organize my thoughts. Now, when I go in to make it, I sit there and say, okay, I want to have the skirt done by this date. For example, I goal to have the skirt done by the end of this month. But that being said, my goal is to have the skirt done by the end of the month. But sometimes there are issues that arise with that, and I sit there like, for example, I was having trouble with the bias tape for a while there because it would move, it wouldn't stay, it wouldn't, this, and this reason, I had to step away, so I went to go work on the top. So I cut the pieces out and I set them up so they could be, so that in the event that, oh, my skirt failed or I was having trouble with something, I can move on to the top. So I was getting something done, but it wasn't necessarily the skirt. Always have a backup plan. Basically, that leads me into always have a backup plan. Just if something is not going right, you just want to make sure that you have something there to back you up, to make sure that you're not wasting valuable time on something that's going to frustrate you. If it's frustrating you, step away. That is the best thing you can do, is step away. Even if you have a plan and this was your plan and you have to follow it letter by letter, step away and reevaluate your plan. They're supposed to change. That being said, sometimes you start making your cosplay and you had this grand idea in your mind and it didn't work and it failed. It doesn't look the way you wanted it to. You whatever reason you hate the way it looks, you don't like the fabric you chose. We've all been there before. Just make sure that you gather a little more info, okay? Find the reason why it failed. Find the reason as to what went wrong. And it's important that you find that reason so it doesn't happen again. Maybe so your plan failed, which is inevitably going to happen. Now, what I do after that, I move on and I say, okay, well, let's go look for new fabric. Let's see what new techniques YouTube or Pinterest or the internet even has to offer. Maybe someone else ran into the problem. Maybe it's fixable. Maybe you want to just go in and fix it. That being said, you're always going to be constantly gathering information throughout the process because it is important that you're constantly learning why something went wrong or how you should improve something. For example, I did a Trish cosplay and I put some vinyl on it, but the vinyl kept falling off. So I was like, okay, well, how can I improve that? So now that I've done that, I improved it by using a better vinyl, something that will stay on. Maybe, which was something that I didn't know about before. And I did test it, but it hadn't been, I guess, convention tested. Conventions can be a little rough on your cosplays if you're very familiar with that feeling. Things will fall apart. So what I like to do is which is part of the last step, but we'll get back to convention testing later. Now that you've gathered your information, it's really time to execute it, and you're going to go back to your planning. You're going to go back into planning, and you're going to say, okay, this failed. I'm going to work on this, and I want to have this done by this date. It's very vague, I know, but I don't want to put specific information because it's very different for everyone. So now you're going to start the construction. So I do have an example right here. We are working on Sam Porter's backpack is what I like to call it. So it is currently in shambles at the moment, but that's because we're layering it. So, for example, we have some pockets here that we created, which took us a while because I find pockets to be a little more difficult than I originally remember them being. So we were talking it over, and we went in and we just recreated them so that they looked a little bit better, which was part of that gathering info. So when I originally had done it, I was trying to sew through the foam that is backing this up at the moment, but it didn't work out very well. So what I did is I went in and I just sewed it on top and treated it like a layer. So now I think it looks pretty good, and it actually holds stuff. So for all you who love going to conventions but never have pockets, just considering functioning pockets is always a plus. Now, as you can see, I have a whole pile here of just mush, but that's because we're building it in layers. So, for example, we have our first 2 layers here. So this would be part of the execution. So we're building, I even have a little example here that we were working with. So we drew the estimated layers on there. I'm sorry, you probably can't see very well. So we have the planned marks, little notes on there that'll help us out when we are building it. And then I even have our base layer, which is the most important layer, I think, out of all of them. This is just an example of how to execute a version of something, but it is an example of how I executed something, or a backpack, and for example, which leads me into my next point, breaking down a cosplay. So this, again, goes right back into planning. You're always going to be constantly planning and evolving with the cosplay. So You've gone into executing the cosplay. You have taken your time again, but you don't like how something turns out, which happens all the time for me. You go right back into planning. You're always going to go back into planning, and you're going to think, okay, well, why don't I like this piece? You're going to break it down and decide how you're going to break down that certain piece that you don't like. For example, I didn't like my original Arabian Ryoko cosplay because I didn't like the fabric that I used. So what I did is I went in and I planned out the fabric I wanted to use, the fabric I was going to replace it with, and then I just fixed that up so that it didn't bother me anymore. That being said, a cosplay is never truly finished. Even after you've executed the cosplay and you feel like you've completed it, you're still going to want to fix something. So after you've completed it and you decided to execute it, for example, you made some gloves for one of your cosplays and you're sitting there, well, I don't like how this is laying. I don't like the finish I used. I don't like the size of the glove. You're going to go back in and you're going to want to remake it. There's nothing wrong with that. It just means that you're constantly fixing the cosplay. You're constantly learning from what you've done. It takes time to learn from those mistakes. I think learning from the mistakes is better because you can always improve upon those. It took me a couple of years before I learned how to construct cosplays in layers, how to fix my mistakes. So that's just how I learned personally. But that's what I really wanted to go over today, was organizing and planning and gathering information for cosplays. Now, I wanted to talk about layering cosplays as well and breaking them down, which is a little more specific. So when you're building cosplays and you're planning your cosplay, you're thinking about how you're going to execute it, breaking down the cosplay. So there are some really complicated ones out there, especially if you look on video games or any kind of like movie that you want to cosplay from. Is very detailed, and you might feel a little overwhelmed by it. Taking a step back and breaking it down into layers and pieces helps, because then you're not thinking about the cosplay as a whole. You're thinking about it as, well, here's one piece of it. Here is the sleeve. This sleeve has this, and this detail on it. How am I going to fix this, and this detail, instead of how am I going to add all of these details all at once? It's kind of mentally straining, very mentally straining if you're thinking about it. And then, so another example I had, I was breaking down my Trish cosplay. I was playing with the fabric, so I was testing finishes to make sure that it looked good, playing with what kind of fabrics I wanted to use, but I was breaking down the patterns and the size of the skirt, which let me find real quick. Okay. But that being said, that is how I like to go about cosplay. I like to organize it in my head, plan cosplay, gather the info, and then break down the cosplay into layers and pieces so that I'm not stressing myself out nearly as much as I used to. And thank you for coming to my stream. I know it wasn't probably as interesting as other streams, but I'm glad I was able to send out that information today.